Don't move. Hands up now.
Officer, there's no cause for this. I'm compliant.
I said don't move. Do it again and you're under arrest.
You're escalating without grounds. Call your supervisor.
Stay right there. One more move and this gets worse.
The gas pump clicked off at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon that would change 2 lives forever. Judge Robert Sterling had stopped for gas on his way home from the courthouse, still wearing his tailored black suit and tie. He had just finished presiding over a complicated custody hearing and was looking forward to a quiet evening at home with his wife of 23 years. The last thing on his mind was that this routine stop would become a national news story that would expose the ugly truth about racial profiling in America. Before we dive into this incredible story, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button because what happens next will absolutely shock you. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this unfolds. Judge Sterling was a respected figure in his community. At 54 years old, he had spent the last decade on the bench after working his way up from a public defender to a prosecutor and finally to his current position. He was known for his fairness, his sharp legal mind, and his commitment to justice. Colleagues described him as someone who never raised his voice in the courtroom but commanded respect through his knowledge of the law and his calm demeanor. He lived in an upscale neighborhood, drove a modest luxury sedan, and was active in local charities. Nothing about Robert Sterling suggested controversy or drama. That Tuesday started like any other day. He had arrived at the courthouse early, reviewed his cases for the day, and handled a full docket of hearings. The custody case had been particularly difficult, involving 2 parents who clearly loved their children but couldn't agree on anything else. Judge Sterling had spent extra time making sure his ruling was fair to everyone involved, especially the kids caught in the middle. By the time he left the courthouse, he was tired but satisfied with the day's work. The gas station where he stopped was one he had used dozens of times before. It was conveniently located between the courthouse and his neighborhood, clean, well-lit, and usually busy with other professionals heading home from work. He pulled up to pump number 6, got out of his car, and began the routine process of filling his tank. He swiped his credit card, selected regular unleaded, and inserted the nozzle into his tank. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, nothing that should have attracted any attention whatsoever. But across the parking lot, Officer David Kane was watching him with increasing interest. Kane was a 15-year veteran of the police force who had been assigned to patrol this area for the past 3 years. He drove an unmarked police cruiser and often stopped at this same gas station for coffee or to fill up his patrol car. On this particular afternoon, he had pulled into the station lot to grab a quick snack when he noticed Judge Sterling at the pump. What happened next would later be dissected by lawyers, civil rights experts, and media analysts across the country. According to Officer Kane's initial report, he observed a black male in expensive clothing acting suspiciously near a luxury vehicle. He claimed the man appeared to be looking around nervously and taking an unusually long time to pump gas. Kane would later testify that his training and experience told him something wasn't right about the situation. But the security footage would tell a completely different story. The cameras clearly showed Judge Sterling behaving exactly like any other customer. He was calm, focused on his task, and not displaying any behavior that could reasonably be described as suspicious. He checked his phone once while the tank was filling, looked up at the price display on the pump, and glanced around the station in the casual way people do while waiting. There was nothing nervous, nothing furtive, nothing that would attract the attention of any reasonable observer. Officer Kane approached Judge Sterling while he was still pumping gas. He didn't announce himself as a police officer initially. Instead, he walked up behind the judge and asked him what he was doing. Judge Sterling turned around, confused by the question, and politely explained that he was putting gas in his car. Kane asked to see his identification. Judge Sterling asked why, noting that he was simply a customer buying gas like everyone else at the station. This is where the situation began to escalate rapidly. Kane became more aggressive in his questioning, asking Judge Sterling where he had gotten the money to afford such an expensive car. He wanted to know where the judge worked, where he lived, and what he was doing in this area. Judge Sterling remained calm but firm, explaining that he had every right to be at the gas station and asking Cain to identify himself as a police officer and explain the reason for the questioning. Cain then made his first critical mistake. He told Judge Sterling that he looked out of place in this neighborhood and that luxury cars were often stolen in the area. He said he was conducting a routine investigation and needed to verify that the car actually belonged to the judge. When Judge Sterling asked to see Cain's badge and identification, the officer became defensive and accused the judge of being uncooperative. Other customers at the gas station were beginning to notice the interaction. A woman filling up her SUV 2 pumps over pulled out her phone and started recording. A man waiting in line at the convenience store stepped outside to see what was happening. The gas station attendant, a college student named Tyler who had worked there for 2 years, later said he immediately sensed that something was wrong with the way the officer was treating the well-dressed customer. Judge Sterling finished pumping his gas and attempted to return the nozzle to the pump, but Officer Cain stepped closer and told him not to move. The judge asked if he was being detained and on what grounds. Cain said he was conducting an investigation and needed the judge to remain where he was until he could verify his identity and ownership of the vehicle. Judge Sterling calmly explained that he had shown his driver's license, which matched both his appearance and the registration of the car, and that there was no legal basis for detaining him further. That's when Cain made his second and far more serious mistake. He placed his hand on his service weapon and told Judge Sterling that he was acting suspiciously and needed to comply with his commands or face arrest. The judge looked at the officer's hand on his gun and realized that this situation had moved beyond mere harassment into something potentially dangerous. Judge Sterling raised his hand slightly and spoke in the calm, measured tone he used in his courtroom. He identified himself as a judge, explained that he was simply buying gas on his way home from work, and requested that Cain call his supervisor to the scene. Cain's response was to laugh and say that he didn't believe the judge's claim about his profession. He said that if Sterling was really a judge, he would prove it by producing a business card or some other evidence of his position. The irony was not lost on Judge Sterling. Here he was, a man who had dedicated his career to upholding the law and ensuring justice, being treated like a criminal by someone who was supposed to serve and protect all citizens equally. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket to retrieve one of his business cards, making sure to move deliberately so as not to alarm the increasingly agitated officer. When Judge Sterling handed Cain his business card, the officer barely glanced at it before dismissing it as fake. He said anyone could print business cards and that he needed real proof. Cain demanded to search the judge's car for evidence of theft, claiming that the vehicle might be stolen despite the fact that Sterling had already shown his registration and driver's license proving his ownership. By this point, several other customers had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation. The woman with the phone was still recording, and at least 2 other people had pulled out their devices to document what was happening. The gas station's security cameras were capturing everything from multiple angles, creating a comprehensive record of Cain's increasingly unreasonable behavior. Have you ever witnessed something like this happening in public? Type yes in the comments if you have, because what happens next shows just how quickly these situations can spiral completely out of control. Judge Sterling refused to consent to a search of his vehicle, explaining that Cain had no probable cause or legal justification for such a request. He pointed out that he had provided identification, proof of ownership, and even his business card showing his position as a judge. He asked again for Cain to call his supervisor and suggested that a simple phone call to the courthouse could verify his identity within minutes. Officer Cain's response was to become even more aggressive. He accused Judge Sterling of being argumentative and uncooperative. He said that innocent people don't refuse searches and that the judge's behavior was making him more suspicious. Cain then made a comment that would later be crucial in the civil rights lawsuit that followed. He said that people like Sterling didn't belong in this neighborhood and that he was going to find out what kind of scam the judge was running. The racial undertones of Cain's comments were not lost on anyone present. Judge Sterling had encountered racism before in his life and career, but never so blatantly from someone in law enforcement. He remained composed, but inside he was both angry and concerned about how far Cain might be willing to take this confrontation. Tyler, the gas station attendant, had been watching the entire interaction unfold. He later testified that he had never seen Officer Kane behave this way toward white customers, even those who were obviously intoxicated or acting genuinely suspicious. Tyler said he had worked at the station long enough to know the difference between a routine police interaction and harassment, and this was clearly the latter. The situation reached a breaking point when Judge Sterling announced that he was going to get back in his car and leave. He had fulfilled any reasonable request for identification and had no legal obligation to remain at the scene. Kane immediately stepped in front of the judge's car door and placed his hand fully on his weapon. He told Sterling that he would be arrested if he attempted to leave before the investigation was complete. This was the moment that would later cost Officer Kane his career and the police department millions of dollars in damages. Judge Sterling stood frozen as Officer Kane's hand gripped his service weapon. The message was clear without words. This had crossed the line from harassment into an implied threat of deadly force. Sterling knew that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted by an officer who was already demonstrating poor judgment and apparent racial bias. The judge slowly reached into his other pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He told Kane that he was going to call the courthouse to have someone verify his identity. Kane immediately ordered him to put the phone away, claiming that Sterling was trying to call accomplices. The absurdity of the accusation would have been laughable if the situation weren't so dangerous. Tyler, the gas station attendant, had seen enough. He went inside and called the police department directly, reporting that one of their officers was harassing a customer for no apparent reason. The dispatcher asked for details, and Tyler explained that a well-dressed black man was being detained and threatened while simply trying to buy gas. He mentioned that other customers were recording the incident and that it was clearly getting out of hand. Meanwhile, the woman who had been recording approached cautiously. She identified herself as Maria Santos, a local teacher, and asked if everything was okay. Officer Kane immediately turned his attention to her, ordering her to move along and stop recording. Maria stood her ground, explaining that she was in a public place and had every right to document what she was witnessing. Kane found himself in an increasingly difficult position. Multiple people were now watching and recording his every move. His radio had been silent, suggesting that no backup was coming, and he was alone in trying to justify his actions. But instead of de-escalating, he doubled down on his initial mistake. The officer demanded that Judge Sterling open his trunk so he could search for stolen goods or drugs. Sterling firmly refused, explaining once again that Kane had no legal authority to conduct such a search without a warrant or probable cause. Kane responded by threatening to call for a drug detection dog, claiming that Sterling's refusal to consent was evidence of criminal activity. Judge Sterling had heard enough. In his calm, judicial voice, he began reciting Kane's violations of his constitutional rights. He explained that he was being detained without reasonable suspicion, threatened without justification, and subjected to what appeared to be racial profiling. He noted that several witnesses were present and recording, and that Kane's conduct would undoubtedly be reviewed by his superiors. This seemed to anger Kane even more. He told Sterling to stop acting like he knew the law and accused him of trying to intimidate an officer. Kane said he had dealt with plenty of criminals who tried to sound smart and that Sterling's legal talk wasn't going to get him out of trouble. The irony was staggering. Here was a police officer telling a sitting judge that he didn't know the law. Another customer, an elderly white man named Frank Peterson, had finished filling up his truck and walked over to see what was happening. Peterson later testified that he was shocked by Kane's behavior. He said he had been coming to this gas station for years and had never seen anything like it. Peterson asked Kane directly what the problem was and why the well-dressed gentleman was being harassed. Kane's response to Peterson was completely different from his treatment of Judge Sterling. He politely explained that he was conducting a routine investigation and asked Peterson to please move along for his own safety. The contrast in tone and demeanor was obvious to everyone present and would later be highlighted in court proceedings. Frank Peterson wasn't satisfied with Kane's explanation. He pointed out that the black gentleman had been nothing but polite and cooperative, and that there was clearly nothing suspicious about someone buying gas. Peterson said he had watched the entire interaction and couldn't understand what law was being enforced. Judge Sterling seized the opportunity to address Peterson directly. He handed the older man one of his business cards and asked him to call the number listed to verify his identity with the courthouse. Peterson looked at the card, looked back at Sterling, and immediately understood what was happening. He had lived through the civil rights era and recognized racial profiling when he saw it. Peterson walked a few steps away and dialed the courthouse number. Within minutes, he was connected to Judge Sterling's clerk, who confirmed that the judge was indeed who he claimed to be and had left the courthouse about an hour earlier. Peterson walked back to Kane and informed him that he had just verified Sterling's identity with the courthouse. Officer Kane's reaction was telling. Instead of apologizing or immediately releasing Judge Sterling, he became defensive and accused Peterson of interfering with a police investigation. Kane said that anyone could have someone answer the phone claiming to work at a courthouse and that the call proved nothing. The mental gymnastics required to maintain Kane's position were becoming increasingly absurd. Multiple forms of identification, witness testimony, recorded verification from the courthouse, and the presence of numerous witnesses recording the interaction all pointed to the same conclusion that Kane was in the wrong. But Kane wasn't ready to back down. He radioed for backup, claiming he needed assistance with an uncooperative subject who was attracting a crowd and creating a disturbance. The dispatcher asked for more details about the nature of the disturbance, and Kane's description bore little resemblance to what was actually happening at the scene. Judge Sterling heard the radio call and realized that Kane was doubling down on his mistake rather than correcting it. The judge knew that when backup arrived, the situation could become even more dangerous if the responding officers believed Kane's false narrative about the incident. Maria Santos, who was still recording, stepped closer and addressed Judge Sterling directly. She said she had captured everything on video and would make sure the footage was preserved, regardless of what happened next. She gave him her contact information and assured him that there were multiple witnesses who would testify to what they had seen. Tyler had returned from inside the gas station and informed Judge Sterling that he had called the police department to report the incident. He said the dispatcher seemed concerned and was sending a supervisor to the scene. Tyler also mentioned that the gas station's security cameras had recorded everything and that his manager would preserve the footage. As they waited for backup to arrive, Kane continued his harassment. He walked around Judge Sterling's car, peering into the windows and looking for any excuse to escalate further. He asked Sterling where he had been earlier in the day, what he did for work, and why he was in this particular neighborhood. Each question was asked in an accusatory tone that suggested Kane believed he was interrogating a criminal rather than a law-abiding citizen. Judge Sterling answered each question truthfully but minimally. He had learned from his years as a prosecutor that giving too much information to hostile law enforcement could sometimes be used against innocent people later. He stuck to basic facts: his name, his profession, and his reason for being at the gas station. The crowd of witnesses continued to grow. Word had spread on social media about what was happening, and people were driving to the gas station specifically to document the incident. Some were live streaming the confrontation, providing real-time coverage to thousands of viewers online. Kane seemed unaware of how badly this was going for him. He was so focused on proving that he was right to detain Judge Sterling that he couldn't see how his actions were being perceived by everyone watching. Every aggressive question, every unreasonable demand, every threat was being recorded and would soon be analyzed by legal experts, civil rights advocates, and police accountability organizations. When the backup unit finally arrived, it wasn't just another patrol officer. Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez stepped out of her cruiser and immediately assessed the scene. She saw a well-dressed black man standing calmly beside a luxury car, surrounded by multiple witnesses with phones out recording. She saw Officer Kane looking agitated and defensive. She saw concerned citizens trying to help and document what appeared to be an unjustified detention. Sergeant Rodriguez had 20 years of experience and had seen situations like this before. She knew immediately that something was very wrong with Kane's conduct. She approached Judge Sterling first, introduced herself professionally, and asked him to explain what had happened. Her calm, respectful demeanor was a stark contrast to Kane's aggressive approach. Judge Sterling gave Sergeant Rodriguez a clear, factual account of the incident. He showed her his identification his business card, and explained that he had been detained for nearly 30 minutes without any legal justification. He mentioned that multiple witnesses had recorded the interaction and that the gas station's security cameras had captured everything. Rodriguez listened carefully and then turned to Cain for his explanation. Cain's version of events was immediately problematic. He claimed Sterling had been acting suspiciously and had refused to cooperate with his investigation. But when Rodriguez asked him to specify what suspicious behavior he had observed, Cain's answers were vague and unconvincing. The sergeant asked Cain why he hadn't run Sterling's license through the system to verify his information. Cain claimed he had been about to do that when Sterling became uncooperative. Rodriguez pointed out that the entire incident could have been resolved with a simple computer check that would have taken less than 2 minutes. She asked Cain if he had called his supervisor before detaining Sterling for such an extended period. Cain said he hadn't thought it was necessary. Rodriguez asked if he had attempted to verify Sterling's claim about being a judge by calling the courthouse. Cain said he didn't trust phone calls because they could be faked. Each of Cain's answers dug him deeper into trouble. Sergeant Rodriguez realized she was dealing with an officer who had either completely lost his judgment or was deliberately targeting Judge Sterling because of his race. Either way, the situation needed to end immediately. What happened next would determine whether this incident became a learning moment or a career-ending catastrophe for everyone involved. Sergeant Rodriguez walked directly to Judge Sterling and spoke in a tone that was professional and respectful. She apologized for the situation and asked if he needed medical attention or felt threatened in any way. Judge Sterling thanked her for her professionalism but said he was fine physically, though deeply concerned about the conduct he had experienced. Rodriguez then did something that Officer Cain should have done 30 minutes earlier. She took Judge Sterling's driver's license and called it in to dispatch for a routine verification check. Within 90 seconds, the response came back confirming his identity, his clean record, and his position as a sitting judge in the county court system. The sergeant's face changed as she received this information. She looked at Cain with an expression that suggested she was struggling to understand how this situation had been allowed to continue for so long. She asked Cain to step aside with her for a private conversation. What they discussed would later be revealed in internal affairs, investigations, and court depositions. Rodriguez asked Cain point blank why he had detained a judge for half an hour without running a basic identification check. Cain claimed he had reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, but when pressed for specifics, his answers became increasingly incoherent. Rodriguez asked if Cain realized that multiple people were recording the interaction and that it would likely become a major incident for the department. Cain seemed genuinely surprised by this information, suggesting he had been so focused on his confrontation with Sterling that he hadn't noticed the growing crowd of witnesses. The sergeant then asked the question that would haunt Cain for the rest of his career. She wanted to know if race had played any role in his decision to detain Judge Sterling. Cain vehemently denied this, claiming he would have acted the same way regardless of the suspect's race. But his denial rang hollow given the evidence of how differently he had treated the white witnesses who had approached during the incident. While Rodriguez was questioning Cain, Judge Sterling was speaking with the witnesses who had recorded the interaction. Maria Santos showed him portions of her video, which clearly captured Cain's threats and unreasonable demands. Tyler provided his contact information and assured the judge that his manager would preserve all security footage from the incident. Frank Peterson, the elderly man who had verified Sterling's identity by calling the courthouse, was particularly supportive. He told the judge that he had served in the military for 20 years and had never seen such unprofessional conduct from someone in uniform. Peterson said he would be happy to testify about what he witnessed if it became necessary. Other customers continued to arrive as word spread on social media. Some came specifically to offer support to Judge Sterling, while others were simply curious about what was happening. The gas station had essentially become the center of an impromptu civil rights demonstration, with people sharing their own stories of police harassment and racial profiling. Rodriguez returned to Judge Sterling and formally apologized on behalf of the department. She explained that Cain's conduct was not representative of their training or policies and that a full investigation would be conducted. She offered to escort the judge home or to provide any other assistance he might need. Judge Sterling accepted the apology graciously, but made it clear that this incident would not be forgotten. He informed Rodriguez that he would be filing formal complaints through every available channel and that he expected a thorough investigation into Cain's conduct and training. He also mentioned that he would be consulting with civil rights attorneys about potential legal action. The sergeant assured him that the department would cooperate fully with any investigation and that Cain would face appropriate consequences for his actions. She provided Sterling with her contact information and the case number for the incident report that would be filed. As Judge Sterling finally prepared to leave the gas station, Cain made one final mistake that would prove costly. Instead of apologizing or showing any recognition of his errors, he approached the judge and said he was just doing his job and that Sterling should understand the difficult position police officers face every day. Judge Sterling looked at Cain with the same expression he used in court when delivering a particularly harsh sentence. He told the officer that doing one's job meant following the law and treating all citizens with equal respect and dignity. He said that Cain's conduct had been a disgrace to the badge and that he hoped the officer would learn from this experience before he hurt someone else. The judge's words were captured on multiple recordings and would later be played in news reports across the country. His calm dignity in the face of such unprofessional treatment resonated with viewers and became a powerful symbol of grace under pressure. Cain's response was to mutter something about judges not understanding real police work. This comment was also recorded and would be used extensively in the subsequent legal proceedings to demonstrate Cain's lack of remorse and his fundamental misunderstanding of his role as a public servant. Judge Sterling drove home that evening with mixed emotions. He was angry about what had happened, but also determined to ensure that other people wouldn't face similar treatment. He knew that his position as a judge gave him resources and credibility that many victims of police harassment didn't have, and he felt obligated to use those advantages to fight for systemic change. That night, Sterling called his wife and explained what had happened. She was shocked and angry, but not entirely surprised. As a successful black woman herself, she had faced her own share of discrimination and bias. Together, they discussed the best way to respond to the incident and decided that Sterling should pursue every available legal remedy. The next morning, Judge Sterling contacted Rebecca Kim, one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the state. Kim had handled numerous high-profile cases involving police misconduct and had a reputation for holding law enforcement accountable for constitutional violations. During their initial consultation, Kim reviewed the video footage that witnesses had shared with Sterling. She was immediately struck by how clearly the recordings showed Cain's escalating aggression and unreasonable demands. Kim told Sterling that this was one of the most clear-cut cases of racial profiling and constitutional violations she had ever seen. Kim explained that they could pursue multiple legal strategies. They could file a civil rights lawsuit under federal law seeking monetary damages for the violation of Sterling's constitutional rights. They could also push for criminal charges against Cain for false imprisonment and civil rights violations. Additionally, they could demand comprehensive reforms of the police department's training and oversight procedures. Meanwhile, the incident was gaining traction on social media. The videos recorded by witnesses had been shared thousands of times, and news outlets were beginning to pick up the story. The sight of a respected judge being harassed and threatened by a police officer struck a nerve with people across the country who had experienced or witnessed similar incidents. The police department found itself under intense scrutiny. Local news stations were calling for interviews, and civil rights organizations were demanding answers. The department's initial response was defensive, with spokespersons saying they couldn't comment on an ongoing investigation. This only fueled more criticism and speculation about what they were trying to hide. Internal Affairs opened an investigation into Cain's conduct within 48 hours of the incident. They interviewed all available witnesses and reviewed the security footage from the gas station. The evidence was overwhelming that Cain had acted improperly and possibly illegally. During his interview with Internal Affairs investigators, Cain continued to insist that he had acted appropriately. He claimed that Sterling had been acting suspiciously and that any reasonable officer would have conducted a similar investigation. When investigators pointed out that Sterling had provided identification and proof of ownership for his vehicle, Kane said that criminals often use fake documents. The investigators asked Kane to explain why he hadn't run Sterling's license through the computer system immediately. Kane claimed he was planning to do that, but was interrupted by Sterling's uncooperative behavior. When they pointed out that Sterling had been cooperative throughout the encounter, Kane became defensive and accused the investigators of second-guessing his field experience. Kane's interview did not go well. His answers were inconsistent, his explanations were unreasonable, and his attitude suggested that he still didn't understand why his conduct was problematic. The investigators concluded that Kane had violated multiple department policies and possibly broken several laws. The Internal Affairs report recommended that Kane be terminated immediately. It found that he had engaged in racial profiling, made an unlawful detention, threatened a citizen without justification, and failed to follow basic procedures for verifying information. The report also criticized Kane's attitude during the investigation, noting his lack of remorse and continued insistence that his actions were appropriate. While the internal investigation was proceeding, Rebecca Kim was building her civil rights case. She gathered statements from all the witnesses, obtained copies of the security footage, and began researching Kane's history with the department. What she found was deeply troubling. Kane had been the subject of multiple complaints over his 15-year career, many involving allegations of racial bias. Previous complaints had been dismissed or resulted in minor disciplinary actions, suggesting that the department had been aware of problems with Kane's conduct, but had failed to address them adequately. Kim discovered that Kane had a pattern of targeting Black and Hispanic drivers for pretextual stops. Department data showed that Kane conducted searches of minority drivers at a rate far higher than his colleagues, despite finding contraband at a lower rate. This statistical evidence would be crucial in proving that the incident with Judge Sterling was part of a larger pattern of discriminatory conduct. The attorney also found evidence that Kane had received minimal training on implicit bias and constitutional policing. His academy records showed that he had struggled with courses on civil rights law and had received poor evaluations for his interpersonal skills. Despite these red flags, he had been allowed to remain on patrol duty without additional training or supervision. Kim filed the federal civil rights lawsuit 3 weeks after the gas station incident. The complaint sought $17 million in damages, citing the egregious nature of Kane's conduct and the department's failure to properly train and supervise him. The lawsuit alleged violations of Sterling's 4th and 14th Amendment rights, as well as state law claims for false imprisonment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The $17 million figure shocked many observers, but Kim explained that the amount reflected both the serious nature of the violations and the need to send a message that such conduct would not be tolerated. She pointed out that Judge Sterling had been threatened with deadly force simply for buying gas while Black, and that this kind of treatment undermined the entire justice system. The lawsuit also named the police department and the city as defendants, alleging that they had maintained policies and practices that encouraged or tolerated racial profiling. Kim argued that Kane's conduct was not an isolated incident, but rather the predictable result of inadequate training, supervision, and accountability measures. News of the $17 million lawsuit made national headlines. Legal experts weighed in on the case, with most agreeing that the video evidence made it extremely difficult for the defendants to mount a credible defense. The clear documentation of Kane's threats and unreasonable demands provided compelling proof of constitutional violations. The police union initially defended Kane, releasing a statement saying that officers often face split-second decisions in dangerous situations and that Kane's actions should be evaluated in that context. However, this defense quickly crumbled as more details about the incident became public. Even other police officers began distancing themselves from Kane's conduct. Public pressure on the police department intensified as community groups organized protests and demanded accountability. The local NAACP chapter called for Kane's immediate termination and for comprehensive reforms of department policies. City council members faced tough questions about police oversight and training at public meetings. The police chief, who had initially tried to defend his department, eventually acknowledged that Kane's conduct was unacceptable. In a press conference, the chief apologized to Judge Sterling and promised that significant changes would be made to prevent similar incidents in the future. He announced Kane's termination and outlined new training requirements for all officers. Kane's termination was swift and decisive. The department's investigation had found clear violations of policy and potentially criminal conduct. Kane was stripped of his badge and gun and escorted from the building by internal affairs investigators. His 15-year career in law enforcement was over. The terminated officer hired his own attorney and threatened to fight his dismissal through the grievance process. Kane's lawyer argued that his client had been made a scapegoat and that his conduct was consistent with his training and department policies. However, this defense strategy faced an uphill battle given the overwhelming evidence of misconduct. Kane also faced the possibility of criminal charges. The district attorney's office opened its own investigation into the incident, focusing on potential violations of Sterling's civil rights under state and federal law. The prosecutor had the video evidence, witness statements, and expert testimony about constitutional violations. Judge Sterling continued his normal judicial duties while the various investigations and legal proceedings moved forward. However, the incident had affected him more deeply than he initially realized. He found himself more aware of racial dynamics in his courtroom and more sensitive to issues of police accountability in the cases that came before him. The judge also became more active in community discussions about police reform. He spoke at town halls and community meetings about his experience and the need for better training and oversight of law enforcement. His unique perspective as both a victim of police misconduct and a member of the justice system gave his voice particular authority in these discussions. Sterling's colleagues on the bench were supportive, but also shocked that such an incident could happen to a sitting judge. Many of them had assumed that their positions would protect them from the kind of treatment that ordinary citizens sometimes experienced. The incident served as a wake-up call about the persistence of racial bias in law enforcement. The case also sparked broader discussions about qualified immunity and police accountability. Legal scholars debated whether existing protections for law enforcement officers were too broad and whether victims of police misconduct had adequate remedies. Sterling's case became a symbol of these larger systemic issues. As the lawsuit progressed through the federal court system, both sides began preparing for what promised to be a high-profile trial. The city's attorneys knew they faced an uphill battle given the clear evidence of misconduct, but they were reluctant to agree to the full $17 million demand without a fight. Settlement negotiations began several months after the lawsuit was filed. The city's insurance company was pushing for a quick resolution to avoid the costs and negative publicity of a trial. However, Judge Sterling and his attorney were not interested in a settlement that didn't include meaningful reforms in addition to monetary compensation. So there you have it, a simple trip to the gas station that turned into a $17 million lesson about justice, accountability, and the price of racial profiling. Judge Robert Sterling walked into that gas station as just another customer buying fuel on his way home. He walked out as the center of a national conversation about police misconduct and civil rights. Officer David Kane thought he could intimidate and harass someone based on the color of their skin and walk away without consequences. He was wrong, dead wrong. His 15-year career ended in disgrace, his actions exposed for the world to see, and his department forced to pay millions for his prejudice and incompetence. The $17 million settlement that eventually came sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the country. It proved that constitutional violations come with a price tag that cities and taxpayers can't afford to ignore. More importantly, it showed that no one is above accountability, not even those who wear badges and carry guns. If you made it this far, thank you for watching this incredible story of justice prevailing over injustice. What do you think about the outcome? Was $17 million enough, or should the consequences have been even more severe? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into how accountability works when the system actually functions properly, Make sure to hit that subscribe button for more stories that prove justice isn't always swift, but sometimes it does arrive exactly when it's needed most. This case was brutal, but the case on the right spirals completely out of control.